For decades, he has been the strongest man in every room, the biggest star on the planet, the highest-paid actor in Hollywood, a man whose name alone sells hundreds of millions of dollars in tickets, a man who built an empire from almost nothing, a man who smiled so wide for so long that the whole world believed the smile was the whole story. But strength was never the thing he was fighting for, and that smile, that famous electric, world-conquering smile, was built on top of something most people never saw coming, something he has spent his entire life trying to outrun. This is the story of Dwayne Johnson. Not the story you think you know, not the story of muscles and movies and catchphrases and championship belts. This is the story underneath all of that. The story of a boy who learned very early that everything you love can vanish overnight, that the ground beneath your feet is never quite solid, that the only thing standing between you and disappearing is how hard you work. Before we go any further, I need you to sit with a few questions. What does it actually cost to become unstoppable? What happens to a man who builds his entire identity around never being weak? When the weakness is still there, underneath, waiting, what is Dwayne Johnson so afraid of, and why? After everything he has achieved, after every record broken, every box office shattered, every obstacle conquered, why does he still wake up before the sun rises and train like someone is chasing him? Because something is chasing him. Something has always been chasing him, and by the time this story is over, you will understand what it is. And you will understand why a man who seems to have everything has never quite been able to stop running. The first thing you need to understand about Dwayne Johnson is where he came from. Not Hollywood, not the wrestling ring. Before any of that, he came from a mattress on the floor of a motel room that someone had abandoned. He came from a car that served as a home. He came from the particular kind of silence that falls over a family when there is no food and no one knows what to say about it. May 2nd, 1972. Hayward, California. A baby boy is born to two people who carry the weight of extraordinary legacies. His father is Rocky Johnson, born Wade Douglas Bowles in Nova Scotia, Canada, a black man who forced his way into a sport that did not want him and made himself into one of the first black tag team champions in WWF history. A pioneer, a fighter, a man who earned his place through pure physical will in an era when the odds were stacked against men who looked like him. His mother is Ata Maivia, Samoan, the daughter of High Chief Peter Maivia, one of the most respected figures in professional wrestling history. A man of enormous presence and cultural significance, a man whose name carried weight across two worlds. Dwayne Johnson came into this world carrying 3 generations of legacy on his back before he could even speak. Think about what that means. Before he took his first step, there was already an expectation, already a standard, already a question hanging in the air. Will this boy be worthy of the name? But here is what the legend never quite told you. Legends do not always make for stable homes. Rocky Johnson was a warrior in the ring. Outside of it, the story was more complicated. The schedule of a professional wrestler in that era meant constant travel, constant absence. And with the absence came other things. Instability, addiction, chaos that rippled through every wall of every apartment the Johnson family tried to call home. By the time Dwayne was 13 years old, his family had moved more than 13 times, sometimes 3 cities in the span of 9 months. Some children grow up with a neighborhood, with a school they walk to every day, with friends whose houses they can visit without directions. Dwayne Johnson grew up learning how to read a new room, instantly, constantly, because the room was always changing. He learned how to make people like him fast. He had to. There was no time for slow friendships. No time to be the quiet kid in the corner. When you arrive somewhere new every few months, you either learn how to connect immediately or you disappear into invisibility. And Dwayne Johnson, even then, did not have the personality for invisibility. But beneath that brightness, beneath that ability to walk into any room and immediately pull people toward him, there was something else growing, fear, the specific, bone-deep fear of a child who has watched his family's belongings packed into bags too many times, who has understood, far earlier than any child should, that safety is not a permanent condition, that warmth and comfort are things that can be taken from you without warning. At 15 years old, that fear became something he could hold in his hands, something concrete. The family hit a wall they could not climb. They were evicted. Thanksgiving was approaching. There was no meal. There was no table. There was no pretending Dwayne Johnson, 15 years old, watched his mother sit in a car that had just been repossessed and break down. Completely. The kind of breaking that a child carries forever, because it is the first time you realize that the people who are supposed to hold everything together are themselves barely held together. He has talked about this moment. He has returned to it over and over in interviews across decades, not because he likes the story, but because that moment made him. It carved something into the center of who he was, a specific belief, born from terror. I will never let this happen again. I will never be this powerless again. I will work until my hands bleed before I ever sit in a car that has nothing left and no place to go. That is not ambition. That is survival. And there is a difference. Ambition is something you choose. Survival is something that chooses you. And once survival becomes the engine of everything you do, it does not simply stop when the danger has passed. It keeps running. It keeps pushing. It does not know how to be still, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because before Dwayne Johnson could become anything, he had to fail. Completely. Publicly. Privately. In ways that almost broke him. And this is where things get complicated. In the early 1990s, Dwayne Johnson was supposed to be a football player, not a wrestler, not an actor, not a global brand, a football player, and for a while it genuinely looked like it might happen. He was 6'5". He was built like architecture. He earned a full scholarship to the University of Miami, one of the most prestigious football programs in the country. In 1991, he was part of a national championship team. He was surrounded by players who would go on to NFL careers. He was in the right place, doing the right thing. But here is what nobody tells you about being almost good enough. Almost good enough is its own kind of torture. Injuries came. Production dropped in his senior year. The NFL draft passed without his name being called. It is a silence that anyone who has ever waited for a door to open can understand. That specific silence when you realize the door has already closed. And you were not behind it. He did not give up. He signed with the Calgary Stampeders of the Canadian Football League in 1995, 23 years old, playing in a league that was not where he imagined himself, but still playing. Still believing, he lasted 2 months. They cut him, and then he made a phone call to his father. A quiet, humiliated phone call from an airport. Come get me. Dwayne Johnson came home from that airport with $7 in his pocket. $7. He would later name his production company $7 Productions. He would build it into an empire worth hundreds of millions. But in 1995, at 23 years old, $7 was not a founding myth. It was just a number. A cruel, small, humiliating number that told him exactly where he stood. He has described what happened next with a directness that is rare for people at his level of fame. Depression. Real depression. The kind that does not present itself as sadness so much as emptiness. The kind that makes the future feel like a wall with no doors. He moved back in with his parents. He slept on a mattress he found abandoned. He ate ramen. He stared at ceilings. Everything he had believed about himself had been organized around football. Since childhood, since the first moment he had discovered he was physically capable of something most people were not, the plan had been football. Football was the escape from the chaos. Football was the proof that the poverty and the evictions and the instability were just the backstory, not the ending. Football was supposed to be the moment where Dwayne Johnson rose above everything that had come before. And now, football was gone. This is where most people's stories end. or take sharp turns into darker territory. The story of the almost athlete who never recovered. The story of the promising young man who fell into resentment or self-destruction, or simply faded into the background noise of unfulfilled potential. But Dwayne Johnson could not fade. It was not in him, not because he was special, but because he was desperate. And desperation, in the right hands, is a kind of rocket fuel. His father began training him. Professional wrestling, the family business, the thing he had grown up around and perhaps never taken entirely seriously because it was everywhere, because it was background, because it was his father's world and not his own. Now it was the only door still open. He walked through it. In 1996, Dwayne Johnson made his debut in the World Wrestling Federation under the name Rocky Maivia, a tribute to both his father and his grandfather. Clean-cut, smiling, presented to the audience as the wholesome third-generation superstar, carrying the legacy with pride. The audience hated him. Not mildly, not with polite indifference. They hated him with the specific vocal hostility that wrestling crowds reserve for performers who feel false. Crowds who can smell the performance and do not want the performance. They want something real, something that bites back. Die, Rocky. Die. That is what the signs said. Think about that for a moment. This man had survived poverty and evictions and the death of a dream he had held since childhood. He had scraped himself back together off a motel floor. He had walked into this industry with almost nothing, and the crowd looked at what he was presenting and told him, loudly, that it was not enough. That who he was performing was not who they wanted. For most people, that would be the end. For a man already fragile from failure, already questioning whether he had anything worth offering the world, being rejected so publicly, could have finished what the football failure started. But something interesting happened. He listened. Not to the cruelty of it, but to the truth underneath it. The crowd was not wrong. Rocky Maivia was not real. It was a constructed tribute, a careful presentation, a version of Dwayne Johnson that had been designed to be safe and palatable and broadly appealing. And the audience, that fascinating, unpredictable organism that is a wrestling crowd, saw straight through it, so he tore it down. He became The Rock, arrogant, swaggering, referring to himself in the third person, cutting promos that crackled with genuine wit and a kind of joyful contempt that felt electrifyingly alive. He took every insecurity, every wound, every desperate need to be seen and respected, and he weaponized it. He turned his real hunger into performance and his real anger into entertainment. And the crowd loved it. They absolutely loved it. Within a short time, The Rock was one of the most electrifying performers in the history of professional wrestling. The catchphrases, the eyebrow, the people's champion. By 1998, he held his first world championship. He was main eventing pay-per-views. He was one of the central figures of the Attitude Era, arguably the most commercially successful period in wrestling history. He had reinvented himself completely. But here is what I need you to understand, because it matters enormously for everything that comes after. The reinvention was real. The success was real. The talent was absolutely, undeniably real. But The Rock was also a mask, and the man who built the mask was still in there. Still that 15-year-old boy watching his mother fall apart in a repossessed car. Still that 23-year-old standing in an airport with $7 and a dead dream. Still afraid. Still running. The mask just got bigger, and more powerful, and harder to take off. By the early 2000s, Dwayne Johnson had begun to look beyond wrestling. The turning point came on a film set. He had been cast as the Scorpion King in The Mummy Returns. A relatively small role, physically demanding, not much to speak of in terms of acting range required. He showed up, he worked, and something unexpected happened. He loved it, not performing. He already knew he loved performing, but the specific kind of storytelling that film allowed, the possibility of becoming someone else entirely, of using everything he had learned about reading a room, about commanding presence, about connecting with an audience, in a new and different context. The Scorpion King spin-off gave him his first lead role, and while the critics were not exactly enthusiastic, the audience showed up, enough to open the door. He walked through it again. But Hollywood, in the early days, was not entirely sure what to do with Dwayne Johnson. He was a wrestler, and the history of wrestlers in Hollywood was not exactly inspiring. The assumption, unstated but pervasive, was that the crossover would be temporary, a novelty, that audiences who wanted action could find real actors to deliver it, that the wrestling audience and the cinema audience were separate organisms that would not successfully overlap. He was advised, by people in the industry who believed they were helping him, to distance himself from his wrestling past, to become something more palatable, more conventional, more like what Hollywood already knew how to market. He tried some of that: family films, comedies, roles that were specifically designed to prove he could do something other than intimidate people physically. And some of them worked, and some of them were very bad indeed, and through all of it, the machine kept grinding. Because the thing that nobody in Hollywood had quite accounted for was this: Dwayne Johnson's work ethic was not a character trait. It was a survival mechanism. He did not know how to not work. The idea of slowing down, of waiting for the right moment, of patiently building a career at a careful pace, none of that was in his vocabulary. Rest, for Dwayne Johnson, was not restoration. Rest was danger. Rest was the mattress on the motel floor. Rest was $7 and no way home, so he kept going. He kept saying yes. He kept waking up at 4 in the morning to train before anyone else was awake. He kept adding one more project, one more commitment, one more thing to prove. And then Fast 5 happened. The Fast and Furious franchise, at that point already a multi-film action series with a devoted audience, introduced a new character, Luke Hobbs, a relentless federal agent who arrives to bring the main characters to justice and promptly has one of the most memorable physical confrontations in the franchise's history. The audience went completely insane for it. Something about Dwayne Johnson in that role, the specific combination of his size, his charisma, his ability to be simultaneously threatening and magnetic, unlocked something in pop culture that had been waiting to be unlocked. Within a very short time, Luke Hobbs was not a supporting character. He was one of the central pillars of one of the highest-grossing franchises in cinema history. The numbers that followed are almost difficult to comprehend. Film after film crossing hundreds of millions of dollars. $1 billion. Multiple billions. His name on a poster became a financial signal, a message to studios and distributors that audiences would show up. He was not just a movie star. He was a reliable economic phenomenon, and with that came everything that success brings. The money, the deals, the endorsements, the production company, the tequila brand, the clothing lines, the social media empire, built personally, carefully, with an understanding of how to use platforms that most people his generation were still trying to figure out. He built a presence on Instagram that reached tens of millions of people. He was his own media company. He was his own brand. He was the architect of every element of what The Rock meant in the culture. He had everything, and I mean that in the literal sense. Every material thing that poverty takes from you, he had accumulated. Security, abundance, the ability to ensure that no one he loved would ever sit in a repossessed car at Thanksgiving. He had won. By every measurable standard, he had won. And yet, 4 in the morning. The alarm goes off. He is already awake. The gym calls. It always calls, not as pleasure, though there is pleasure in it, but as necessity, as ritual, as the thing that keeps the fear at bay for another day. One more film, one more project, one more commitment layered on top of commitments that already require superhuman management to fulfill. The question that nobody was quite asking yet, in the middle of all that triumph, was a simple one. What happens when The Rock never gets to rest? What happens when the mask fuses with the face? What happens when the survival mechanism becomes so powerful, so all-consuming, that it cannot distinguish between the danger that made it necessary and the safety that should have made it unnecessary? What is Dwayne Johnson without the grind? This is where the story gets complicated. This is where the tragedy lives, not in the failures. Not in the poverty or the evictions or the $7 in the airport. Those were the wound. The tragedy is in what grew over the wound. Let us talk about something that Dwayne Johnson has been more open about in recent years than almost any other public figure of his scale and stature. Depression. He has talked about it more than once, quietly, deliberately, in ways that felt personal rather than performative. He has talked about experiencing it after his football career ended. He has talked about experiencing it at other points in his life. He has spoken about his mother's struggles with depression. A moment, early in his career, when she walked into traffic in a moment of crisis, and he has carried that with him ever since. He has said in interviews words that are simple and true and necessary. It is okay to not be okay. And he has said something else that I want you to sit with for a moment. He has said that depression is not a switch you can simply flip off. That knowing you are depressed does not make you not depressed. That being strong, being capable, being the person everyone else depends on, none of that makes you immune. Think about what it means to carry that knowledge inside the armor of the rock. Because the armor is real. The discipline is real. The 4 a.m. workouts are real. Every achievement is genuinely, irreducibly real. This is not a story about a man who is secretly weak. Dwayne Johnson is one of the most impressive human beings in terms of sheer will and output that the modern era has produced. But the armor is doing 2 jobs simultaneously. It is building an empire, and it is keeping something at bay. The fear of going broke again, not metaphorically, literally. He has spoken about it. The specific terror that everything could disappear, that the bottom could fall out, that he could be standing in an airport again with $7 and nowhere to go. That fear does not care about the box office numbers. It does not respond to the Forbes list. It does not quiet down when the accountant sends encouraging emails. It runs on its own logic. And its logic says the only protection is more. More work, more output, more proof, more achievement. More. Workaholism is often discussed as though it is a character flaw, a kind of vanity or ambition run amok. But in Dwayne Johnson's case, it is something more specific and more human than that. It is a child's response to a terrifying world, operating inside an adult body, driving a machine of extraordinary capability. The child says, "If I stop, everything falls apart." The child says, "Rest is how you get surprised." The child says, "The only way to be safe is to never stop moving," and the machine responds, "Understood. Keep going." By the time Dwayne Johnson is at the height of his powers, somewhere in his 40s, the machine is moving at a pace that would break most people. Multiple films a year, production responsibilities, brand commitments, physical training that is, by any objective standard, extreme, public appearances, social media, family, father to daughters he loves deeply and clearly, still processing the complicated grief of a relationship with a father who was both inspiring and absent, both a legend and a demon. There are reports, over the years, of chronic lateness on film sets, of schedules so packed that the basic courtesies of professional life become casualties of the calendar. He has acknowledged some of this. He has pushed back on the extremes of what has been written. But the underlying reality is clear enough. A man running this hard will occasionally drop things. The question is what he is running from that requires this particular speed. And there is another thing. Emotional isolation. Not the obvious kind. Dwayne Johnson is surrounded by people. He has a partner who clearly loves him, daughters who adore him, colleagues who respect him, millions of fans who feel a genuine personal connection to him through the intimacy of social media. He is not alone in any external sense, But there is a particular loneliness that lives inside the experience of being the rock, a loneliness that is the specific product of being the strong one, of being the person everyone else leans on, of being the symbol of resilience for millions of people who need that symbol and who do not quite have room, in their relationship with you, for the version of you that is scared. The charisma that Dwayne Johnson developed as a nomadic child, that instant ability to connect, to read a room, to give people what they need from you in any given moment, that charisma serves him extraordinarily well in almost every context of his professional life. But charisma is also a shield. When you are very good at giving people what they need from you, it becomes very easy to never quite show them what you need from them. He is always performing. Even when the performance is authentic, and it often is, it is still a performance. The workout posts, the motivational messages, the behind-the-scenes glimpses, the personal disclosures carefully calibrated for connection without full exposure. None of it is false. But none of it is quite the whole thing either, because the whole thing is complicated. The whole thing includes the depression and the fear and the complicated grief and the man beneath the rock, who is not always sure where one ends and the other begins. He is also a father in the specific, deliberate way that people become who had complicated relationships with their own fathers. Rocky Johnson was a legend. He was also an addict. He was also frequently absent. He was also a man of enormous physical presence and personal charisma who passed both of those things to his son, along with the wounds that came with them. Dwayne Johnson has spoken about his father with honesty and complexity. He loved him. He admired him. He was shaped by him in ways that are both gifts and burdens. The discipline, the drive, the understanding of what it means to perform. All of that came from Rocky Johnson, at least in part, but so did the fear of abandonment. So did the need to prove. So did the understanding, learned young, that the most powerful man in your world can also be unreliable, can also be lost to something you cannot control, can also leave. Rocky Johnson passed away in January 2020. There is grief in that which is still unresolved, as grief tends to be. The particular grief of losing a parent before every conversation is finished, before every wound is healed, before you have fully figured out how to love them and be angry at them simultaneously without the anger winning. Dwayne Johnson's daughters are, by all accounts, the center of his emotional life. He has spoken about fatherhood with a warmth and vulnerability that is distinct from how he speaks about almost anything else. There is something in those relationships, with children who are still young enough to know him as Daddy, before they know him as the Rock, that seems to give him access to a part of himself that the rest of his life does not always reach. He knows the math. He knows that his daughters will one day see everything. The archives of interviews and films and social media posts and controversies and achievements. They will form their own understanding of who their father was, in full, with all the complexity that entails. And perhaps somewhere in that knowledge is a motivation that is different from the others. Not the fear of going broke, not the need to prove, but the desire to leave something true behind, something that says, I was more than the machine, I was more than the grind, I was someone who understood what really mattered, even when the understanding was hard to act on. He has drawn on his father's addiction and his family's chaos for dramatic material. In preparing for more serious dramatic work, he has gone back to those rooms, those memories, those versions of the people who made him who he is, and used them as raw material. That is not exploitation. That is transformation. That is the highest possible use of pain, turning it into something that other people can see themselves in, and audiences do see themselves in him. That is perhaps the most interesting thing about Dwayne Johnson's particular kind of celebrity. He is not relatable in the ordinary sense. There is nothing ordinary about his body, or his wealth, or the scale of his fame. But the story underneath is relatable. The poverty is relatable. The failure is relatable. The depression is relatable. The fear of not being enough is the most relatable thing in the world. People love The Rock, in part because The Rock is proof that those things are survivable, that you can come from nothing and be broken by life and still find a way to build something extraordinary, but the message is more complicated than it looks, because the cost of what Dwayne Johnson built, the relentlessness, the refusal to stop, the armor that never fully comes off, that is also a message. And it is a message that not everyone can afford to receive uncritically. There is a version of Dwayne Johnson's story that ends here, with triumph. The boy from nothing who became everything. The broken man who rebuilt himself again and again, with nothing but will and the memory of what it felt like to have nothing. The champion, the icon, the unstoppable force, and that version is true. But it is not the whole truth. The whole truth is more difficult and more human and more worth sitting with. The whole truth is that the machine Dwayne Johnson built to survive his childhood never quite got the message that the childhood was over, that the danger had passed, that it was safe now to put down some of the weight. The whole truth is that the man behind The Rock, the one who wakes up in the dark and cannot stop, the one who still feels the $7 in his pocket even when his bank account looks nothing like $7, the one who built a monument to survival without ever quite building a home inside it, that man is still working something out, something about what it means to be enough, something about what rest is allowed to feel like when you grew up learning that rest was the beginning of disaster, something about how to be present when presence requires you to be still, and stillness is the thing that scares you most. He is still learning. He is more open about it now than he has ever been. The willingness to say, I have been depressed. I am not immune. I am not the armor. I am the person inside it. That is not a small thing. For a man of his platform and his archetype, that is genuinely courageous. There is a specific kind of courage that is harder than physical strength, harder than grind, harder than the discipline to wake up at 4 in the morning and push past limits that would defeat anyone else. It is the courage to be seen as something other than strong, to say, I am not only what I can withstand, I am also what I feel, I am also what I lost, I am also the boy who had nowhere to go and nothing in his pocket and no idea if any of this would ever be okay. He is moving toward that, slowly, carefully, in the way that people who have spent decades inside an identity move when they begin to sense that the identity, as useful as it has been, is not the same as a self. And perhaps that is the most honest and unexpected thing about Dwayne Johnson at the height of his success. He is still becoming, not in the polished, inspirational poster sense of constant growth, in the messy, uncertain human sense of a person who built something extraordinary and is now trying to figure out what to build next. Something quieter, maybe. Something that does not require the whole world to be watching. Something that belongs to him in a way that The Rock has never quite been able to. So what do we make of all of this? What is the tragedy of Dwayne Johnson? It is not the poverty. Poverty was the beginning, but it was also, in its terrible way, the gift. The forge. It is not the failures. The football career that ended. The CFL cut. The $7. Those were the wounds that made him real. It is not even the depression, though that is real and important and worth taking seriously. The tragedy, if we are going to call it that, and I think we should, is something subtler. It is the distance between the life that has been built and the peace that has not quite been reached. It is the man who has given the world an image of invincibility and must now live inside that image, even on the days when invincibility is the last thing he feels. It is the survival mechanism that saved his life and built his empire, and that also, in the quiet hours, will not let him fully rest. It is the question of whether a person can ever truly outrun the version of themselves that was forged in crisis, or whether that version is simply always there, underneath everything, running alongside. Dwayne Johnson has said in his own words that feel like the most honest thing anyone could say at the summit of everything they ever wanted. The fear does not go away. It changes. It evolves. It becomes more manageable, perhaps, or at least more familiar. But it does not go away. And perhaps that is not only a tragedy. Perhaps there is something else in it too, something instructive, something that tells us that the people who seem most invincible are not invincible at all. They are simply the ones who refuse to let their fear make the final decision. The strongest people in the world are not the ones who feel no fear. They are the ones who feel it completely and keep going anyway. But then this is the question I want to leave with you. Is keep going anyway always the right answer? What happens when the keeping going is no longer about survival, but about the inability to conceive of any other way to exist? What does it mean to become unstoppable? If you were never given permission to stop, what does it cost to be that strong for that long for that many people? And who carries the weight for the person who carries everything? Dwayne Johnson is still here, still working, still waking up in the dark, still building, still becoming. But somewhere beneath all of that, beneath the brand and the box office and the 4 a.m. alarms and the smile, that the whole world knows there is still a boy who stood in an airport with $7 and didn't know if he would ever be. Okay, he made it, but the boy is still there. And maybe, if we are being honest with each other, that is not a tragedy. Maybe that is just being human. The question is whether the boy is only the fuel, or whether, someday, he is also allowed to be the destination. Sometimes the strongest people in the world are just the ones who never felt safe enough to stop.